They called my faith a burden. Those words still echo in my mind like a death sentence pronounced over everything I held sacred. How do you recover when the people you love most tell you that talking to God makes you a disease? Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Deborah Ann Whitaker, and I am 68 years old. I live in Dayton, Ohio. At least I used to call it living. The morning light filtered through my basement window, barely illuminating the concrete walls that had become my world. The smell of bleach and mildew clung to everything, mixing with the dampness that seeped through the foundation stones. This wasn't how I imagined spending my golden years. I sat on the edge of my narrow cot, my arthritic fingers wrapped around the worn wooden beads of my rosary. The familiar texture brought comfort to hands that had worked for decades, cooking, cleaning, nurturing, praying. These same hands had once served Sunday dinners on fine china upstairs, had braided my granddaughter's hair, had held my dying husband's trembling fingers as we prayed together one last time. The house above me creaked with the footsteps of people who had once called me family. My son David's heavy work boots crossed the kitchen floor, probably reaching for his morning coffee. Heather's lighter steps followed, her voice already sharp with the day's first complaints. And somewhere between those sounds, the gentle padding of my 11-year-old granddaughter Emily, getting ready for school. This house, my house, had been filled with 41 years of memories. George and I had bought it as newlyweds, dreaming of children's laughter echoing through its rooms. We had prayed at that kitchen table every morning, thanking God for his blessings. We had raised David here, teaching him to say grace before meals, to respect his elders, to trust in the Lord's plan even when times got hard. But George was gone now, taken by cancer 3 years ago. And I had learned that when death visits a family, it doesn't just take the person, it takes the version of yourself that existed in their love. My phone buzzed against the concrete floor where I had placed it the night before. A text message from David. "Mom, we need to talk about your habits. Heather says Emily is asking uncomfortable questions about religion. Maybe tone it down? Tone it down. My faith, my prayers, my lifeline to the only source of comfort I had left in this world." I stared at those words until they blurred through my tears. 43 years of motherhood, and it had come to this, being asked to hide the very thing that had sustained me through his childhood illnesses, his teenage rebellions, his college struggles, his wedding day, his job losses, and now his return to my home with his own family in tow. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, when David had called in desperation, his job gone, Heather's medical bills mounting, their apartment lease terminated, I had welcomed them with open arms. I had changed the guest room sheets, stocked the refrigerator with Emily's favorite foods, rearranged my entire life to make space for theirs. "Mom, we just need a few months to get back on our feet," David had said, his voice breaking with the kind of vulnerability that took me back to when he was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. I had signed over my bedroom to them, moved my belongings to the basement, and told myself it was temporary. Just until they could stand on their own again. Just until God opened another door for them. Just until my sacrifice bore the fruit of restored family unity. But sacrifice, I was learning, doesn't always breed gratitude. Sometimes it breeds resentment in those who can't bear the weight of owing someone they've decided to see as beneath them. The first sign had been small. Heather asking me to keep my religious items in my room. The crucifix that had hung in our living room for 4 decades suddenly made the space feel gloomy, she said. The rosary I sometimes held while watching television made Emily uncomfortable. The grace I wanted to say before family meals was too formal for their modern lifestyle. David said nothing. Each time his wife criticized something sacred to me, my son, the boy I had raised to defend the defenseless, looked away. I began to disappear in my own home, not physically, not at first, but spiritually. The woman who had once filled these rooms with hymns and prayers became a ghost, moving quietly through spaces where her presence was merely tolerated. This morning was different, though. This morning, as I clutched my rosary in the dim basement light, I heard Emily's voice upstairs, bright and curious as always. "Mommy, why can't Grandma eat breakfast with us anymore?" "Because, sweetheart." Heather's voice carried clearly through the thin ceiling. "Grandma needs her own space, and we need ours." But it was David's response that shattered something inside me. "Your grandmother has habits that not everyone understands. It's better this way." Habits. My faith had become a habit. My relationship with Jesus Christ, the foundation of my life for 68 years, had been reduced to an inconvenient quirk that embarrassed my own son. I pressed the crucifix hanging from my rosary against my lips and whispered a prayer that came from the deepest part of my wounded heart. "Jesus, help me understand. Is this the test? Is this how you're preparing me for something greater? Or am I simply watching everything I believed about family crumble like dust?" The basement air felt thinner suddenly, as if even oxygen was rationed in this underground exile. Above me, the sounds of my family preparing for their day continued, a day that would unfold entirely without my participation, in a house where I had once been the heart, but was now merely the forgotten foundation. As I stood to begin another day of invisible existence, I caught my reflection in the small mirror above the utility sink. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 68, her eyes carrying the particular weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from spiritual abandonment. When had I become someone to be managed rather than loved? When had my faith, the very thing that made me who I was, become a burden others had to bear? I touched the glass, tracing the lines around my eyes, and made a promise to the woman in the mirror. Today I will pray even if it disturbs them. Today I will speak to God even if they call it crazy, because if I stop being who I am to make them comfortable, I will have nothing left to give anyway. The day ahead stretched before me like a long, narrow corridor with no windows and no clear destination. But I had my rosary, I had my faith, and I had the growing certainty that God was about to teach me something about the difference between being used and being loved. Memory has a cruel way of preserving the moments that hurt the most, while letting the beautiful ones fade like photographs left in sunlight. As I sat in that basement holding my rosary, the ghosts of my generosity haunted every corner of this house. 43 years ago, when David was born, I had knelt beside his crib and promised God I would raise him to be a man of faith. Those early years were painted in golden hues, Sunday morning church services where David's small hand fit perfectly in mine, bedtime prayers where he'd whisper his innocent request to Jesus, Christmas mornings when we'd read the nativity story before opening a single gift. "Mommy, why do we pray every day?" 5-year-old David had asked once, his pajama-clad legs dangling from the kitchen chair. "Because God listens, sweetheart," I had answered, braiding his hair away from his face. "And because when we talk to him every day, he helps us become the people he wants us to be." How naive I had been to think that foundation would last forever. The first crack appeared when David turned 16. George and I had sacrificed for months to buy him a used car for his birthday. Not because we had the money, but because we believed in investing in our son's future. We had eaten generic groceries and skipped our anniversary dinner, putting every spare dollar toward that rusty Honda Civic that represented freedom to him and financial strain to us. The night we surprised him with the keys, David had barely looked up from his phone. "Thanks," he mumbled, already texting friends about weekend plans that didn't include family dinner or Sunday service. "Aren't you going to thank God for this blessing?" George had asked gently. David's eye roll was swift and dismissive. "Come on, Dad. You bought the car, not God." I had felt something cold settle in my stomach that night, but I pushed it away. Teenagers rebel, I told myself. This was just a phase. But phases have a way of becoming permanent when no one challenges them. College brought new expenses and new distances. We refinanced the house to help with David's tuition, believing that education was an investment in his character as much as his career. Every semester I'd send care packages filled with homemade cookies and handwritten notes, reminding him of our prayers. The thank you calls became shorter, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. When David graduated and moved to Cincinnati for his first job, our contact dwindled to obligatory holiday visits. He'd arrive on Christmas Eve, leave on December 26th, and spend the time in between checking emails and taking work calls. The young man who once helped me set up the nativity scene now barely glanced at it. "Mom, do we really need to say grace?" he'd ask when we gathered for Christmas dinner, his impatience poorly concealed. "We're all adults here." George would catch my eye across the table, and I'd see my own heartbreak reflected in his weathered face. But we'd bow our heads anyway, and I'd thank God for having David home, even if his heart seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The wedding was when I fully understood how far my son had drifted from the values we'd planted in him. Heather was modern. That's the kindest word I can use. She rolled her eyes when I suggested we include a Bible verse in the ceremony program. She forgot to invite our pastor to the rehearsal dinner. She wore a dress so revealing that George had whispered a quiet prayer for modesty under his breath. "Mrs. Whitaker," Heather had said during the final fitting, her voice carrying that particular tone educated people use when they're explaining something to someone they consider simple. "I hope you understand that David and I want our wedding to be inclusive. Not everyone shares your particular beliefs. My particular beliefs. As if faith in Jesus Christ was a quirky hobby rather than the cornerstone of existence." I had smiled and nodded, already learning the art of spiritual invisibility that would define the rest of my relationship with my son's wife. "Of course, dear, whatever makes you both happy." But happiness, I was discovering, was a moving target that required increasingly greater sacrifices from those deemed less important. When Emily was born, I had allowed myself to hope again. Surely this precious child would soften their hearts, would remind them of the miracle of life, would open them to the possibility that some things were bigger than human understanding. I had driven to Cincinnati every weekend for the first 3 months, helping with midnight feedings, doing laundry, preparing meals while Heather recovered. I'd sing lullabies to Emily, hymns my own mother had sung to me, and watch this tiny person's face relax into peace. "She likes your singing," David had observed one evening, genuine warmth in his voice for the first time in years. "Music is the language of the soul," I had replied, gently rocking my granddaughter. "She recognizes something holy in it," Heather had snorted from the couch. "Or she just likes the rhythm. Don't read too much into it." Even my granddaughter's responses to beauty and peace had to be explained away, reduced to mere biological reactions rather than evidences of spiritual hunger. The financial help had started small. A few $100s when David's car needed repairs. $1,000 when Heather's father was hospitalized and they needed to travel. $5,000 when they wanted to buy their first house, but were short on the down payment. Each request came with promises of repayment that never materialized and expressions of gratitude that felt increasingly hollow. George and I would pray about each decision, asking God to guide us in supporting our son without enabling irresponsibility. We always chose generosity, believing that love required risk. "Maybe we should ask for some kind of timeline," George had suggested after the 3rd loan request in 2 years. "They're struggling, honey," I had replied, my heart unable to see manipulation where love should have been. "We're blessed to be able to help. God will provide for us." And he had, somehow. We lived more simply, saved more carefully, found joy in smaller pleasures. But our sacrifice seemed to breed expectation rather than appreciation in David and Heather. The grateful phone calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. The promises to repay became vaguer. When George got sick, David visited twice in 6 months. Twice. While I spent sleepless nights in hospital chairs, holding my husband's hand and praying for miracles that didn't come, my son was too busy with work to make the 3-hour drive more than once every few months. The night George died, I had called David through my tears. "He's gone, sweetheart. Daddy's gone. I'm so sorry, Mom," he had said, and I could hear genuine grief in his voice. "We'll be there tomorrow for the funeral arrangements." They arrived 6 hours before the service, stayed for the reception, and left the next morning. Heather spent most of the visitation on her phone, fielding work calls that apparently couldn't wait for grief to run its course. David gave a brief, impersonal eulogy that mentioned George's work ethic and reliability, but nothing about his faith, his prayers, his daily example of Christian love. In my darkest moments of widowhood, sitting alone in this house that echoed with 41 years of shared life, I had clung to my rosary like a lifeline. The smooth beads beneath my fingers connected me to something larger than grief, something more permanent than human love. Jesus, I would whisper into the darkness, help me understand your plan. Help me trust that this pain has purpose. And somehow, in ways I couldn't explain to people like Heather who demanded scientific proof for everything, peace would come. Not happiness. That seemed too much to ask, but peace. The deep, steady assurance that I was not alone, that my suffering was seen, that my tears were collected by someone who understood the weight of loving people who couldn't love you back properly. When David called 3 years later with news of his job loss and housing crisis, my first instinct had been gratitude. God was giving me another chance to serve, another opportunity to show love in action, another way to prove that family meant something beyond convenience and comfort. Of course you can come home, I had said without hesitation. This will always be your home. I had prepared the house like I was welcoming royalty. Fresh sheets on the master bedroom, groceries for Emily's favorite meals, space cleared in closets for their belongings. I had prayed for wisdom in helping them rebuild their lives, for patience in navigating the adjustments of multi-generational living, for grace to be the grandmother Emily deserved. What I hadn't prayed for was protection from the very people I was trying to protect. 6 months had passed since they moved in, and the gratitude had evaporated like morning dew. The temporary arrangement had become permanent expectation. The appreciation had transformed into entitlement so complete that my continued existence in my own home was now presented as an inconvenience they graciously tolerated. Last week, I had overheard Heather on the phone with her sister. Living with David's mother is challenging. She's so stuck in the past. All that religious stuff is really oppressive. Emily's starting to ask questions, and honestly, I don't want her exposed to that kind of guilt-based thinking. Guilt-based thinking. That's what 43 years of trying to raise a son with moral foundations had been reduced to. Guilt-based thinking. As I sat in the basement that had become my exile, surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations that would never again grace the main floor, I wondered if love was supposed to hurt this much. I wondered if Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, had ever felt the particular agony of watching people you die for treat your love like a burden they couldn't wait to discard. Am I being tested? I whispered to the concrete walls, or just forgotten. The silence that answered felt heavier than any voice could have been. The cruelest wounds are the ones that happen slowly, like water wearing away stone, until one day you realize there's nothing left where something solid used to be. The basement had become my world. But even there, I couldn't escape the daily reminders that my presence was merely tolerated. It was Tuesday morning when I discovered they had changed the locks. I had gone upstairs to make my morning coffee, a small ritual that connected me to the decades when this kitchen had been the heart of our home. But my key wouldn't turn. I stood there for a full minute, twisting the metal in the lock, before the truth settled over me like ice water. "Oh, you're up early." Heather's voice came from behind me, artificially cheerful in the way people sound when they've been caught doing something they know is wrong. I turned to face my daughter-in-law, still holding the useless key. "The lock? David installed a new one yesterday for security." She breezed past me, her silk robe rustling with the confidence of someone who belonged here more than I did. "There's been some break-ins in the neighborhood." Break-ins. In a neighborhood where the most exciting crime was Mrs. Henderson's cat getting into someone's garbage. "Could I have a new key?" The words came out smaller than I intended. Heather paused, her hand on the coffee maker I had bought 30 years ago. "Well, the thing is, we're trying to maintain some boundaries. You know, family space versus guest space. Guest space. In my own home. I just wanted coffee," I whispered. "There's instant coffee downstairs. I put some by the utility sink yesterday." She said it like she was doing me a tremendous favor. "It's actually better for you. Less caffeine." I nodded and retreated to the basement, my cheeks burning with a shame I couldn't name. The instant coffee was generic brand, the kind that dissolves into bitter water no matter how much you stir. I sat on my cot, sipping liquid humiliation, and tried to pray away the anger that was growing like a tumor in my chest. "Jesus," I whispered, "help me understand love without dignity. Help me serve without resentment." But even my prayers felt hollow in the concrete cave they'd created for me. The isolation wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, social. A systematic erasure that happened one small cut at a time. Sunday mornings had always been sacred to me. Even in my darkest days after George's death, I had found comfort in the familiar rhythms of worship, the community of faith that reminded me I wasn't alone in the world. St. Mary's Catholic Church had been my spiritual home for 4 decades. Father Martinez knew my name, my struggles, my prayer requests. "Mom, we need to talk about Sundays," David announced one evening, cornering me as I folded laundry in the basement. His voice carried the patronizing tone of an adult explaining rules to a difficult child. "What about Sundays? You take the car to church for 3 hours every week. Heather has errands to run. Emily has activities. We need more flexibility with transportation." I stared at him, my hand still clutching one of Emily's school shirts. I could take Emily with me. She might enjoy— No, the word was sharp, final. We're not raising Emily with religious confusion. She needs to make her own choices when she's older. Religious confusion. That's what they called exposure to the faith that had shaped every good thing in David's character. What little remained of it. "I could walk," I said quietly. "It's only 2 miles. David's face softened slightly, probably realizing how harsh he sounded. "Mom, you're 68. It's not safe for you to walk that far." But it was safe for me to slowly disappear in the basement of my own home. The compromise was brutal in its efficiency. I could attend the early morning service, 7 a.m. on Sundays, when the car wasn't needed, but I had to be back by 9:30 for their family breakfast, and I couldn't invite anyone over afterward. That first early Sunday, I sat in a pew surrounded by mostly elderly parishioners, many of whom I'd known for decades. Mrs. Chen noticed me immediately. "Deborah, honey, we haven't seen you at the regular service lately. Is everything all right?" I opened my mouth to explain, then realized I had no words for what was happening to me. How do you tell people that your family considers your faith an embarrassment? How do you admit that you've become a stranger in your own home? "I'm just trying new things," I managed. She studied my face with the wisdom of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "Well, you know where to find us if you need anything. If I need anything." The phrase followed me home like a stray dog, reminding me of how much I needed and how little I felt worthy of asking for. The birthday was the worst. My 68th birthday fell on a Thursday in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I woke that morning with the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, my family would remember. Maybe they'd want to celebrate the woman who had given them shelter when they had nowhere else to go. I stayed in the basement until nearly 10, waiting for footsteps on the stairs, for Emily's sweet voice calling, "Happy birthday, Grandma," for some acknowledgement that this day mattered. Nothing. Finally, I climbed the stairs to find the kitchen empty, except for dirty breakfast dishes and a note. "Gone to Emily's soccer practice. Back around 3. D." They hadn't forgotten. They had simply decided my birthday wasn't worth acknowledging. I spent the day alone, sitting in my basement cave, holding a photograph of George and me from our last birthday together. He had been so sick by then, barely able to stand, but he had insisted on making me a cake from a box mix. It was lopsided and too sweet, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for me. "I miss you," I whispered to his picture. "I miss belonging somewhere." Around 7 that evening, Emily appeared at the top of the basement stairs. "Grandma? Mommy said I should come say goodnight." "Come here, sweetheart." I patted the cot beside me, and she came down, her small body warm and real in a day that had felt like a mirage. "Are you sad, Grandma?" The question hit me like a physical blow. This child, innocent and perceptive, had noticed what her parents had ignored. "Sometimes, honey, but I'm always happy when I see you." She hugged me tightly, her arms fierce with 11-year-old love. "I drew you a picture at school today. Want to see?" She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. It was a drawing of 2 figures, one tall, one short, standing in front of a house. Both figures were smiling, and there were flowers everywhere. "That's you and me," Emily explained. "In the picture, you live upstairs again, and we make cookies together like we used to." I had to close my eyes to keep from sobbing. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That night, after Emily went upstairs, I sat alone with her drawing spread on my lap, the child's innocent vision of how things should be, grandmother and granddaughter together, both happy, both valued. Seemed like a fantasy from another lifetime. I heard them upstairs, preparing for their evening routines, Heather helping Emily with homework, David watching the news. The sounds of a normal family living a normal life, while I existed below them like some shameful secret they kept hidden in the basement. Thanksgiving arrived like a punishment disguised as a holiday. I spent the morning in the basement, listening to the sounds of preparation above, laughter, music, the clatter of dishes being arranged. The smell of turkey and stuffing drifted down through the ceiling, torturing me with memories of Thanksgivings when I had been the one creating those smells, when this house had been filled with my cooking and my prayers of gratitude. Around noon, Heather appeared at the top of the stairs. "Deborah, we're having some friends over for dinner. It would be better if you stayed downstairs today. I left a plate for you in the refrigerator." A plate. Like I was a pet being fed scraps. "Of course," I said. Because what else could I say? That this was my house? That Thanksgiving had been my holiday for 41 years? That I had recipes passed down from my grandmother that they were probably ruining upstairs? I spent Thanksgiving afternoon listening to strangers laugh in my dining room, eating cold turkey and instant mashed potatoes while sitting on a cot in the basement. The green bean casserole, my green bean casserole made from my mother's recipe, was apparently a hit based on the compliments I could hear through the ceiling. "Heather, this is incredible. Where did you get the recipe?" "Oh, it's a family secret," I heard her reply. A family secret. She had stolen my recipe and erased my existence in the same breath. That night, I knelt beside my cot and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself asking the question that had been growing in my heart like a cancer. "God, am I being punished for something? Is this what I deserve for some sin I can't remember? Because I don't understand how love is supposed to feel like this." The concrete walls absorbed my whisper and gave back only silence. The next morning, I found Emily sitting on the basement stairs, still in her pajamas. "Grandma, are you okay? I heard you crying last night." I looked at this child, this beautiful, innocent child who still saw me as worth loving, and felt something crack open in my chest. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they miss people. Do you miss Grandpa George?" "Every day." She was quiet for a moment then. "Grandma, why don't you live upstairs anymore?" The question I had been dreading, asked with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "Because," I said carefully, "sometimes families need different kinds of space." "But this isn't space," Emily said, looking around the basement with 11-year-old logic. "This is hiding, out of the mouths of babes." That afternoon, I walked to the public library, the one place where I could sit without anyone questioning my right to exist in peace. I found a quiet corner and opened my Bible to Psalm 27. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." The words blurred through my tears, but I kept reading, clinging to the promise that somewhere, someone still counted me as worthy of love. "Even if my family abandons me," I whispered, "you won't abandon me." But as I sat in that library chair, surrounded by strangers who treated me with more dignity than my own family, I wondered if faith was enough to survive the slow murder of the spirit that was happening in my own home. "Am I disappearing, Jesus?" I asked the empty air. "Is this how people die without actually dying?" December arrived with the kind of bitter cold that seeps into your bones and stays there, no matter how many layers you wrap around yourself. But the chill in my own home had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with the ice forming around my family's hearts. It was Emily who finally shattered the pretense we'd all been maintaining. I was sitting in the basement, mending one of her school sweaters by the dim light of a single bulb, when I heard her voice upstairs, loud and defiant in a way that made my hands freeze mid-stitch. "I want to eat dinner with Grandma." "Emily, we've talked about this." Heather's voice carried the strained patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "Grandma prefers to eat alone. She has different dietary needs." "That's not true!" Emily's voice cracked with the righteous anger that only children can muster when they see injustice. "Grandma doesn't prefer anything. You just don't want her upstairs." The silence that followed was deafening. I could picture David and Heather exchanging the kind of look parents share when their carefully constructed lies are exposed by innocent honesty. "Young lady," David's voice was sharp with authority, "you don't speak to your mother that way. Then why don't you speak to Grandma at all?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out, overwhelmed by this child's fierce loyalty to someone the adults had written off as disposable. "Go to your room," Heather said coldly. "Now." "I hate you," Emily screamed, and I heard her feet pounding up the stairs to the second floor. "I hate you and I want to live with Grandma." The slam of her bedroom door shook the house. 10 minutes later, Emily appeared at the top of the basement stairs, her face streaked with tears and her small body shaking with sobs. "Grandma? Can I come down?" "Of course, sweetheart." I set aside the mending and opened my arms. She flew down the stairs and into my embrace, her tears soaking through my thin sweater. "They're being mean to you, and I told them to stop, but they won't listen." I held her tight, this precious child who saw clearly what the adults refused to acknowledge. "Oh, honey, you don't need to fight my battles." "But it's not fair." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes blazing with 11-year-old fury. "This is your house, you told me so. Daddy said you lived here before I was even born." "I did live here first," I admitted quietly. "Then why do you have to hide down here like you did something wrong?" How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most become the people who hurt you worst? How do you tell her that love and cruelty can live in the same house, in the same family, sometimes in the same moment? "Sometimes," I said carefully, "grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand, even when they love each other." "Do they love you?" Emily asked with devastating directness. The question hit me like a physical blow. Did they love me? When had I last felt loved by my son? When had Heather ever treated me with the respect due to someone she cared about? "I think," I said slowly, "they love the idea of me, but maybe not the real me." Emily considered this with the solemnity of a judge. "I love the real you, Grandma. I love when you pray and when you sing hymns and when you tell me stories about Jesus. Mommy says that stuff is weird, but I think it's beautiful." I started crying then, the tears coming from a place so deep I'd forgotten it existed. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, saw beauty where her parents saw embarrassment. She found comfort where they found inconvenience. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for loving all of me." That night, after Emily had reluctantly gone back upstairs for bed, I heard David's heavy footsteps on the basement stairs. He appeared in the doorway, his face set in the expression he used to wear when he was about to deliver bad news. "Mom, we need to talk." I set down my Bible and folded my hands in my lap, preparing myself for whatever fresh humiliation was coming. "Emily is getting confused," he began, not meeting my eyes. "She's starting to act out, asking uncomfortable questions. We think it might be better if you found other living arrangements." Other living arrangements. As if I were a problematic tenant rather than the woman who had given him life, raised him, and opened her home when he had nowhere else to go. "This is my house, David." "I know, Mom. But legally, you signed it over to me 6 months ago, remember? For tax purposes?" The papers. I remembered signing papers he'd said were just formalities, legal protections that would help me avoid probate issues if something happened to me. He'd explained it so carefully, so lovingly, assuring me it was just paperwork that wouldn't change anything practical. "You said it was just for taxes," I whispered. "It was. But the situation has changed. Emily is being affected by the tension in the house." Tension. That's what he called the systematic erasure of my dignity, the daily humiliation of being treated like an unwanted guest in my own home. "What tension, David? The tension of my existing?" His face flushed red. "Don't be dramatic, Mom. You know that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about? Tell me exactly what I've done wrong." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. Finally, "You make people uncomfortable." "How?" "The constant praying, the religious stuff everywhere, the way you, I don't know, judge everything through that lens." "I don't judge. You do, Mom. Maybe you don't mean to, but you do. When Heather serves wine with dinner and you won't touch it. When we watch a movie and you make those faces. When Emily asks questions about God and you fill her head with all that guilt. Guilt. There was that word again. The weapon they used to turn my faith into something shameful. Is loving Jesus guilt, David? It is when you use it to make other people feel bad about their choices. I stared at my son, this man I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through every failure and celebration, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Somewhere along the way, the boy who used to pray with me had become a man who saw prayer as an attack on his lifestyle. I never made you feel guilty, I said quietly. I loved you through everything, every mistake, every rebellion, every time you broke my heart. I never stopped loving you. I know you love me, Mom, but love doesn't mean enabling. Enabling. He was using my own words against me, the language I'd used when I'd worried about giving him too much money, too much support, too many chances to avoid the consequences of his choices. What am I enabling by existing in my own house? You're enabling Emily to think that adults should accept behavior that makes them uncomfortable just because it's family. The logic was so twisted, so completely backwards, that I actually laughed. You mean I'm teaching her that families should love each other unconditionally? I mean, you're teaching her that emotional manipulation is okay if you wrap it in religion. Emotional manipulation. My faith, my prayers, my desperate attempts to maintain some connection to the sacred in a house that had become profane, all of it reduced to manipulation. David, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. I have never manipulated anyone. I have loved you, supported you, sacrificed for you, and prayed for you every single day of your life. If that feels manipulative to you, then maybe the problem isn't my faith. Maybe the problem is your conscience. His face went white, then red, then something uglier than anger. Don't you dare try to guilt me with that righteous act. It's not an act. It is. It's always been an act. The perfect Christian mother, the martyred widow, the long-suffering grandmother. Well, guess what, Mom? We see through it. We know this is all just a way to control people, to make them feel bad when they don't live up to your impossible standards. I stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement painful, but I needed to be on my feet for this. I needed to look my son in the eye when I said what came next. Is that really what you think of me? After 43 years of loving you? Is that really who you think I am? I think you're a woman who uses religion to avoid dealing with reality. I think you pray instead of acting, judge instead of accepting, and manipulate instead of communicating. Each word was a nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we'd had left. I could feel something dying between us, some last thread of connection that had survived his indifference, his ingratitude, his casual cruelty. And I think, I said quietly, you're a man who's so afraid of being accountable to anything bigger than his own desires that you've convinced yourself love is manipulation and faith is weakness. He stepped back as if I'd slapped him. You don't know anything about my life. I know you've forgotten everything good I tried to teach you. I know you've turned my granddaughter against her own heritage. I know you've taken my home, my dignity, and my place in this family. And you've convinced yourself you're the victim. You want to know what you've taken from me? His voice rose to a shout. You've taken my peace. You've taken my marriage. Heather can't stand living here with you hovering around, judging every decision we make, making her feel like a failure because she doesn't live up to your saintly example. I've never judged Heather. You don't have to say anything. It's in your face, your silence, your prayers. Every time she makes a choice you wouldn't make, you retreat to your corner and pray about it like she's some lost soul you need to save. Don't I have the right to pray in my own home? Not when your prayers are accusations. We stared at each other across the basement, mother and son, separated by something wider than the Grand Canyon and deeper than any ocean. I could see in his eyes that he believed what he was saying, that in his mind, my faith had become the villain in his story, rather than the foundation of whatever good was left in him. Would Jesus forgive this too? I asked, more to myself than to him. Should I forgive again? There you go again, he said, his voice dripping with disgust. making everything about your religion, making me the sinner and you the saint. I'm not a saint, David. I'm just a woman who loves God and wanted to raise a son who would do the same. Well, congratulations, Mom. Mission failed. The words hung between us like a death sentence. My son, my only child, the boy I had prayed over every night for 43 years, had just told me that everything I'd tried to build in him was worthless. I'll start looking for somewhere else to live, I said quietly. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. I think that's best. As he climbed the stairs, I heard him mutter under his breath, maybe now we can have some peace. Peace. They wanted peace without me in it. That night, I knelt beside my cot and prayed harder than I had since George died. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't praying for my family. I was praying for myself, for strength, for clarity, for the courage to stop accepting crumbs from people who should have been offering me the whole loaf. Jesus, I whispered, if this is what love looks like, I think I've been doing it wrong. The morning after David's ultimatum, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Something had shifted in the darkness, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of my soul. For the first time since they'd moved in, I wasn't asking God to change my family's hearts. I was asking him to show me what he wanted me to do with mine. I dressed quietly in the basement shadows, choosing my best blouse. The navy blue one George had always said brought out my eyes. If I was going to reclaim my dignity, I might as well look like someone who deserved it. The public library opened at 8 a.m., and I was waiting by the door when Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, arrived with her keys jangling and a steaming cup of coffee in her gloved hand. My goodness, Deborah, you're here early this morning. I need to use the computers, Margaret, and I need to make some phone calls. Something in my tone must have told her this wasn't my usual gentle request for internet access. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd seen people at their breaking points before. Computer lab's all yours, honey, and if you need privacy for those calls, you can use my office. The first search I conducted was Elder Law Attorney, Dayton, Ohio. My fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose I hadn't felt in years. 3 names appeared with good reviews and free consultations. I wrote them down in my careful handwriting, the same script that had once penned love notes to my husband and thank you cards to people who didn't deserve my gratitude. The second search was harder to type. Property Deed Transfer Reversal, Ohio Law. What I found made my heart race. Under Ohio law, property transfers made under duress or false pretenses could be challenged, especially when involving elderly family members. The articles spoke of undue influence and financial exploitation, terms that felt like someone had been watching my life and taking notes. I printed everything, page after page of legal precedents, statutes, and procedure explanations. The printer hummed and spit out my future in black and white, while I sat in that library chair feeling more powerful than I had in months. By noon, I had appointments scheduled with 2 attorneys for the following week and a folder thick with documentation of my rights. But more importantly, I had something I'd lost along the way, the absolute certainty that I deserved better. When I returned to the house, my house, David and Heather were in the kitchen, whispering over coffee like conspirators planning a coup that had already succeeded. "Mom, there you are," David said, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "We've been talking about timelines. For your move." I set my purse down on the counter where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where I'd helped David with homework, where I'd held him when he cried over his first broken heart. "I'm not moving." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across both their faces. "Mom, we discussed this last night." "You discussed it. I was informed. There's a difference." Heather's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Deborah, I think we all agreed that this arrangement isn't working for anyone." "No, Heather. You and David decided this arrangement isn't convenient for you. But since this is my house, legally, financially, and morally, I'm deciding that the arrangement that isn't working is having ungrateful tenants who treat their landlord like a burden." David's face went pale, then red. "Mom, you signed papers you misrepresented to me. Papers I signed under false pretenses while grieving and trusting my son to protect my interests rather than exploit them. I pulled out one of the legal documents I'd printed at the library. According to Ohio Revised Code, Section 581533, property transfers involving elderly family members can be reversed when obtained through undue influence or misrepresentation of facts. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the sound of two people realizing their carefully constructed advantage was built on quicksand. "You can't be serious," Heather whispered. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." David found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Mom, think about what you're doing. We're family. We can work this out." "Are we family, David?" "Because family doesn't evict elderly relatives to make room for convenience. Family doesn't hide their matriarch in the basement like a shameful secret. Family doesn't steal someone's home and call it paperwork. We didn't steal— what would you call taking someone's house under false pretenses and then forcing them to live in the basement?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Even David's gift for rationalization couldn't twist this reality into something noble. "Where will we go?" Heather asked. And for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely afraid. "That's not my problem to solve. You're both adults with jobs and resources. You'll figure it out the same way you would have if I'd never offered you help in the first place." "You can't just kick us out," David said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a child testing boundaries. "I'm not kicking you out. I'm establishing terms for your continued residence in my home. Terms that include treating me with respect, acknowledging my rightful place here, and ending the systematic campaign to erase my existence." I pulled out a handwritten list I'd prepared at the library. "First, I will have access to the entire house I own. No locked doors, no restricted areas, no basement exile. Second, my religious practices and beliefs will be respected, not hidden or criticized. Third, Emily will be allowed to spend time with me without restriction or interference." "You can't dictate how we raise our daughter," Heather protested. "I'm not dictating anything. I'm explaining that if you want to continue living here rent-free, you'll need to stop treating your benefactor like a burden and your daughter's grandmother like a disease." David was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. "This isn't like you, Mom." "No, it isn't. The woman you've been taking advantage of was someone who confused enabling with loving, who thought martyrdom was virtue, who believed that accepting mistreatment was somehow Christian. But that woman was dying in your basement, David, and I decided I'd rather save her than please you." I took a deep breath, feeling air fill my lungs in a way it hadn't for months. "You have 48 hours to decide. Accept these terms or find somewhere else to live. Either way, I'll be sleeping in my own bedroom tonight." With that, I walked past them, climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, and began reclaiming my life one room at a time. The bedroom felt enormous after months in the basement. Sunlight streamed through windows that faced the garden George and I had planted 20 years ago. The bed, my bed, was unmade, covered with Heather's clothes and David's work papers, as if they'd never expected to be displaced from the space they'd usurped. I gathered their belongings methodically, folding clothes with the same care I'd always used, placing personal items in boxes with gentle hands. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. I wasn't taking anything from them that had ever been theirs to begin with. When I was finished, I sat on the edge of my bed and called Emily's school. "This is Deborah Whitaker, Emily Morrison's grandmother. I'd like to add myself to the approved pickup list for emergency contacts." "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker. Are you currently listed as an emergency contact?" "I should be, but I'd like to confirm. And I'd like to schedule a meeting with Emily's teacher to discuss her academic progress." "Absolutely. I have an opening Thursday afternoon, when I would be having my first consultation with an elder law attorney, beginning the process of legally securing everything I'd reclaimed through sheer force of will." That evening, I cooked dinner for the first time in months. Not just heated leftovers or eaten from a plate someone else had prepared, but actually cooked. I made pot roast, George's favorite, with potatoes and carrots and the kind of gravy that takes patience and attention to get right. The smell filled the house like a benediction, announcing that someone who cared about nourishment and comfort and the sacred act of feeding people was back in charge of the kitchen. Emily appeared first, drawn by the aroma like a bee to honey. "Grandma, it smells like home again," She wrapped her arms around my waist while I stirred the gravy, and I felt something heal inside me that I hadn't even realized was broken. "Are you cooking for everyone?" she asked hopefully. "I'm cooking for my family," I said. "Anyone who wants to act like family is welcome to join us." David and Heather appeared in the doorway as I was setting the table. The good china, the cloth napkins, the centerpiece I'd made from evergreen branches and candles. The table looked like holidays used to look, like celebrations were meant to look, like family dinners in homes where people actually loved each other. "Smells good," David said quietly. "Thank you. Would it be all right if we joined you?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the man who'd been systematically erasing me from my own life, but the boy who used to help me set this same table, who used to say grace in his little boy voice, who used to tell me about his day over meals I'd prepared with love. "Of course," I said. "Family dinners are for family." We sat around the table in careful silence, passing dishes and serving portions like diplomats negotiating a delicate treaty. Emily chattered about school, filling the awkward spaces with 11-year-old observations about teachers and friends and the upcoming Christmas pageant. "I'm playing Mary in the nativity scene," she announced proudly. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, smiling at her genuine excitement. "Will you come watch, Grandma?" Before I could answer, Heather cleared her throat. "Emily, we've talked about this. Your grandmother might not be comfortable with public events." "Why wouldn't I be comfortable?" I asked evenly. Heather flushed. "I just thought, with everything that's been happening, what's been happening is that I've been treated like an embarrassment. But I'm not embarrassed by my granddaughter or my faith or my presence in public spaces. I'd be honored to watch Emily in the Christmas pageant." "Really?" Emily bounced in her chair. "You'll really come?" I wouldn't miss it for the world. That night, for the first time in months, I knelt beside my own bed in my own room and prayed not from desperation, but from gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered to the ceiling that no longer trapped me in a basement cave. "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to choose between love and dignity. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is refuse to enable people's worst instincts." I climbed into bed, my bed, with my pillows and my blankets and my view of the stars through windows that belonged to me, and slept more peacefully than I had since George died. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more conversations, more opportunities to choose self-respect over self-sacrifice. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had remembered her own worth, sleeping in her own home, dreaming of a granddaughter who would grow up knowing that love never requires you to disappear. The 48 hours I'd given them felt like holding my breath underwater. Every moment stretched tight with anticipation, every sound in the house loaded with meaning. But this time, instead of drowning in anxiety, I found myself floating on a peace I hadn't felt since George's death. I had placed my situation in God's hands, and for the first time in months, that felt like placing it somewhere safe rather than somewhere silent. Wednesday morning brought the first test of my newfound resolve. I was making coffee in my kitchen, when Heather appeared in the doorway, her hair uncombed and her face bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night arguing in whispers. "Deborah, we need to talk." "Good morning, Heather." "Coffee?" She blinked, clearly expecting a different kind of interaction. Yes, thank you." I poured her a cup, added the cream and sugar I'd noticed she preferred, and handed it to her with the same courtesy I'd have shown any guest in my home, because that's what she was now, a guest whose welcome depended entirely on her behavior. "David and I talked all night," she began, settling at the kitchen table where Emily's homework from the previous evening still lay scattered. "We want to find a solution that works for everyone. I'm listening. We understand that this is your house. We appreciate everything you've done for us, but some of your conditions feel extreme." I sipped my coffee and waited. I'd learned that silence was often more powerful than argument, especially when dealing with people who expected emotional reactions they could manipulate. "The religious thing, specifically," Heather continued, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone navigating a minefield. "We're not asking you to hide your faith, but Emily is at an impressionable age, and we want her to make her own choices about spirituality when she's older." "What religious thing? Specifically?" "The constant praying. The rosary beads. The intensity of it all. It makes people uncomfortable. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. Heather, when you say people, who exactly do you mean? Well, us, Emily, our friends. I see. And when you say my faith makes Emily uncomfortable, has she told you that herself? A flush crept up Heather's neck. She doesn't have to say it. Children absorb these things. All that guilt and judgment. What guilt? What judgment? You know what I mean. No, I don't. Explain to me exactly how my praying in my own home constitutes guilt or judgment toward anyone else. Heather stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. She'd grown so accustomed to my accepting her criticisms without challenge that my simple request for specifics seemed to short-circuit her entire argument. It's just the way you do it. Like you're suffering. Like you're making some kind of statement about the rest of us not being holy enough. Heather, I said gently, I think the problem isn't my prayers. I think the problem is that my prayers remind you of something you've lost, and that makes you angry. I haven't lost anything. Haven't you? When was the last time you felt connected to something bigger than your own immediate needs? When was the last time you experienced wonder, or gratitude, or the peace that comes from knowing you're not alone in the universe? Her face had gone very still. I don't need religion to feel fulfilled. I didn't say you needed religion. I said you needed connection to something transcendent. That's different for everyone. But attacking someone else's source of connection because it reminds you of your own emptiness, that's not protecting Emily. That's protecting your own comfort zone. We sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows, and I could hear Emily upstairs getting ready for school. Her morning routine a symphony of closet doors and running water, and the particular energy of a child preparing to meet the day. What do you want from us? Heather asked finally. I want you to remember that this house has been a home of faith for 41 years. I want you to respect that Emily has a grandmother who loves God and isn't ashamed of it. And I want you to understand that if my presence in my own home makes you uncomfortable, the solution isn't for me to change. The solution is for you to examine why love between a grandmother and God threatens you. Heather stood up abruptly, leaving her coffee half-finished. You can't therapy your way out of this, Deborah. We have legitimate concerns. Then present them legitimately, with specifics, with examples, with something more substantial than, it makes us uncomfortable to treat someone's core identity as a problem to be solved. That afternoon, David tried a different approach. I was in the living room, reading my Bible in the chair by the window, the chair where I'd nursed him as a baby, where I'd read him bedtime stories, where I'd waited up for him during his teenage years. He sat across from me on the sofa, his body language careful and controlled. Mom, I owe you an apology. I looked up from the Gospel of Matthew, marking my place with my finger. For what, specifically? For the way we've handled this situation. For making you feel unwelcome in your own home. Thank you. But I need you to understand something too. Heather and I aren't against your faith. We're concerned about balance. What kind of balance? Emily needs exposure to different perspectives. She needs to learn critical thinking, not just acceptance of religious doctrine. I closed my Bible and gave him my full attention. David, what religious doctrine do you think I'm forcing on Emily? It's not forcing exactly. It's just, she comes home asking questions about prayer, about heaven, about whether people who don't believe in God go to hell. Those are heavy concepts for an 11-year-old. And you'd prefer she never ask those questions at all? I'd prefer she ask them when she's old enough to evaluate the answers critically. When is that exactly? 16? 21? When she's already formed her worldview based on the absence of any spiritual framework? When she's already concluded that the material world is all there is? David shifted uncomfortably. That's not what we're doing, isn't it? You're telling her that her grandmother's relationship with God is something to be hidden, questioned, criticized. You're teaching her that faith is embarrassing, that prayer is weird, that people who believe in something bigger than themselves are somehow defective. We're teaching her to think for herself. No, David. You're teaching her to think like you. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain I hadn't seen since he was a child. I can't live the way you and Dad lived. I can't base my decisions on what some invisible deity might want. I can't pray away problems that require action. I can't find comfort in promises that might not be true. And there it was, the heart of the matter. Not Emily's spiritual education, not Heather's comfort, not my inconvenient presence. My son had lost his faith, and my continued belief felt like a judgment on his choice. "Oh, sweetheart," I said softly, "I'm not asking you to live like me. I'm asking you to let me live like me." "But Emily is a smart, loving child who's capable of understanding that different people find meaning in different ways. She can love her grandmother's faith without being forced to adopt it. She can respect your choices without being forbidden to explore her own. What if she chooses religion over reason? What if she chooses both? What if she becomes someone who thinks deeply and prays deeply, who questions everything and trusts in love? What if she becomes the kind of person who can find beauty in a sunset and wonder in a scientific equation?" David looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something crack in his carefully constructed defenses. "I used to pray," he said quietly. "When I was little, I believed God was listening." "What changed?" "Life. Reality. The fact that all that praying didn't stop Dad from getting cancer, didn't make our marriage easier, didn't prevent any of the hard things that happened anyway. And you decided that meant God wasn't there?" "I decided it meant God either wasn't there or didn't care. Either way, I stopped seeing the point." I reached across the space between us and took his hand. The hand I'd held when he was learning to walk, when he was scared of storms, when he needed comfort only a mother could provide. "I forgive you," I said simply. "For what?" "For being angry at God. For losing your faith. For taking that anger out on mine. For trying to protect Emily from something you see as disappointment. I understand why you did it. And I forgive you." His eyes filled with tears he'd probably been holding back for years. "I don't want Emily to get her hopes up the way I did. And I don't want Emily to live without hope the way you have." We sat there in the living room where I'd raised him, where his father had played with him, where we'd been a family that prayed together and loved each other through everything. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of understanding, of love that didn't require agreement to exist. "The 48 hours are almost up," David said finally. "Yes, we'd like to stay, if you'll have us. Under the conditions I outlined?" He nodded slowly. "We'll try. I can't promise it'll be easy for any of us, but we'll try. That's all anyone can do." That evening, Emily burst into the house like a small hurricane of excitement, her backpack flying as she ran to find me. "Grandma, guess what? I got the lead in the Christmas pageant. I'm going to be Mary." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." I caught her in my arms, spinning her around the way George used to do when she was smaller. "And Mrs. Patterson said I could invite my whole family to come watch. Will you come? Will you really come?" I looked over her head at David and Heather, who were watching this interaction with expressions I couldn't quite read. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said. "I'll be in the front row cheering for you. Even if other people are there? Even if it's in the church? Especially because it's in the church. That's where angels belong." Emily hugged me tighter, and I felt something shift in the house. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of understanding. We weren't the same family we'd been before. We might never be. But we were still a family, still bound by love that could stretch without breaking, still capable of finding ways to honor each other's truths without sacrificing our own. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed not for my family to change, but for wisdom to love them exactly as they were while never again hiding exactly who I was. "I won't enable you anymore," I whispered into the darkness. My words meant for God and my son and myself, but I won't stop loving you either. Help me find the difference. The house settled around me with the peaceful creaks of a home where people were learning, finally, to tell the truth. 3 weeks after reclaiming my home, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I signed up for the church's weekly Bible study group, not because I needed to learn more about Scripture. 41 years of marriage to a faithful man and a lifetime of Sunday services had given me a solid foundation, but because I needed to remember what it felt like to be around people who saw my faith as a gift rather than a burden. The group met every Thursday evening in the parish hall. a cozy room with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle that invited conversation rather than lecture. When I walked in that first night, carrying my worn leather Bible and a notebook, I felt like someone returning to a country she'd been exiled from for too long. "Deborah!" Father Martinez greeted me with genuine warmth. "How wonderful to see you here. I've been wondering how you've been managing since George passed." The question might have devastated me 6 months ago, but now it felt like recognition of my humanity, rather than pity for my circumstances. "I'm finding my way, Father. One day at a time. That's all any of us can do." The group was small, 8 people ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s, all carrying the particular weariness that comes from wrestling with life's harder questions while still believing in love's ultimate victory. There was Margaret, a widow like myself whose husband had died 2 years prior. James, a retired teacher whose daughter had stopped speaking to him after his wife's suicide. Carol, a nurse whose faith had been tested by years of watching people suffer despite her prayers for their healing. We were not the shiny, happy Christians that television evangelists like to showcase. We were the walking wounded who had chosen to keep walking anyway, who had learned that faith wasn't about avoiding pain, but about finding meaning within it. "Tonight we're reading from Romans 8, Father Martinez began, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate the gap between doctrine and daily living. Paul writes, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Carol raised her hand. "Father, I struggle with that verse. I've seen too many children die, too many good people suffer. How do we reconcile all things work for good with the reality of senseless tragedy?" I found myself speaking before I'd consciously decided to share. Maybe it's not that God causes the suffering. Maybe it's that God can bring good even from the worst things people do to each other. The group turned to look at me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Please," Father Martinez said gently. "Continue. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. About the difference between what God allows and what God causes. About how sometimes the worst experiences can teach us things we couldn't learn any other way." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you mean?" I thought about David's cruelty, about Heather's dismissal, about the months I'd spent in that basement feeling invisible and worthless. Then I thought about the strength I'd discovered in that darkness, the clarity that had come from hitting bottom, the way losing everything had taught me what actually mattered. I mean that sometimes people treat us terribly, and that's on them. But how we respond, what we learn, who we become, that's where God does his work. Not in the suffering itself, but in what we do with it. James nodded slowly, like my daughter cutting me off after her mother died. I can't control her anger or her need to blame someone, but I can control whether I let that destroy my love for her or teach me to love more deeply. "Exactly," I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. God didn't make my family treat me badly, but he gave me the strength to stop accepting it and the wisdom to set boundaries with love instead of anger. As the conversation continued, I felt something awakening in me that had been dormant for months. Not just faith, I'd never lost that, but purpose, community, the particular joy that comes from sharing spiritual insights with people who understand both the questions and the quest for answers. After the session, Margaret approached me in the parking lot. "Deborah, would you like to get coffee sometime? I feel like we might have a lot to talk about." "I'd love that. And there's something else. The church is starting a support group for women who've experienced family estrangement. Father Martinez asked if I'd help coordinate it. Would you be interested in co-facilitating? Family estrangement." The phrase hit me like a gentle slap of recognition. That's what I'd been experiencing. Not just conflict or disagreement, but systematic emotional disconnection from people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. "I don't know if I'm qualified." "Qualification isn't about credentials," Margaret said softly. "It's about having walked the path and found your way through. You just demonstrated that beautifully tonight." The following Sunday, I did something else I hadn't done since David and Heather moved in. I invited someone over for dinner. Margaret arrived at 2 p.m. with a bottle of wine and a loaf of homemade bread. and we spent the afternoon cooking together in my kitchen while Emily helped with the simple tasks and chatted about school. "Your house feels so peaceful," Margaret observed as she chopped vegetables for the salad. "You can sense the years of love here." "Thank you. George and I were very happy here." "And now?" I considered the question while I seasoned the chicken. David and Heather had adjusted to the new boundaries with varying degrees of grace. But the house did feel different now, more honest somehow, less burdened by the weight of unspoken resentments and unexpressed needs. Now I'm learning to be happy here again. Differently than before, but genuinely. Emily looked up from the carrots she was peeling. "Grandma, are you going to tell Mrs. Margaret about the prayer group you want to start?" Margaret raised her eyebrows. "Prayer group?" I felt my cheeks warm. "It's just an idea. Something for people who want to pray together but maybe feel isolated in their families." "Tell me more." "Well, I was thinking about people like us. People whose faith is seen as old-fashioned or embarrassing by their loved ones. People who need a safe space to pray without feeling judged or analyzed or managed." Margaret set down her knife and turned to face me fully. "Deborah, that's brilliant. When can we start?" "Really? You think it's a good idea?" "I think it's exactly what a lot of people need, including me." We decided to start the following Wednesday evening, meeting in my living room for what we'd simply call prayer and fellowship. I spent the week preparing, not just cleaning the house and planning refreshments, but preparing my heart for the possibility that God might be calling me to something new, something that had grown out of my suffering but wasn't defined by it. The first meeting drew 5 women, all in their 60s and 70s, all carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from loving people who consider that love a burden. We sat in a circle in my living room, the same room where I'd been relegated to silent exile just months before, and shared our stories with the freedom that comes from being truly heard. Ruth spoke about her son who'd forbidden her from mentioning God around his children. Patricia shared her struggle with a daughter who'd moved across the country to escape what she called her mother's religious obsession. Linda wept as she described holidays spent alone because her family found her faith depressing. "I don't understand," Linda said through her tears. "I'm not asking them to believe what I believe. I'm just asking them to let me believe it without making me feel ashamed." "That's because faith threatens people who've lost it," I found myself saying. "It reminds them of something they've given up, and that makes them angry. But why take it out on us?" "Because it's easier to silence the reminder than to deal with the regret." We prayed together that night. Not the careful, generic prayers that get offered in mixed company, but the desperate, specific, deeply personal prayers of women who'd been holding their spiritual needs in silence for too long. We prayed for our children's hardened hearts, for our own strength to love without enabling, for wisdom to know when to speak and when to be silent. But most importantly, we prayed in gratitude, for finding each other, for the reminder that our faith was valuable enough to defend, for the gift of community that had grown from individual isolation. "Thank you, Jesus," I whispered, as we joined hands for closing prayer, "for showing me that my faith isn't a burden, it's a bridge, to you, to purpose, to people who understand that love doesn't require hiding who we are." On Thursday evening, Emily's Christmas pageant filled St. Mary's Sanctuary with the particular magic that happens when children take on roles bigger than themselves. I sat in the 3rd row, wearing my best dress and holding a small bouquet of flowers for my granddaughter, surrounded by families whose children were also learning to embody timeless stories of hope and redemption. When Emily walked onto the stage wearing a blue robe and carrying herself with the serene dignity of someone portraying the Mother of God, I felt tears stream down my face. Not just because she was beautiful, though she was, but because I was there to witness it, because I hadn't been banished or hidden or made to feel ashamed of my presence in this sacred space. David and Heather sat beside me, and while I couldn't claim they were comfortable with the religious nature of the performance, they weren't openly hostile either. They applauded when Emily spoke her lines, smiled when she sang the lullaby to the baby Jesus doll, and seemed genuinely proud of their daughter's participation in something holy. After the performance, as we gathered in the parish hall for cookies and punch, Father Martinez approached our family. "Emily was wonderful," he said warmly. "She has a natural reverence that's rare in children her age." "Thank you, Father," David replied, and I was surprised to hear no edge in his voice, no defensiveness about clerical influence on his daughter. And Deborah, Father Martinez continued, I hear wonderful things about your new prayer group. You're meeting a real need in our community. Thank you for letting us use the parish hall when my living room gets too small. Emily tugged on my sleeve. Grandma, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'll help with the Easter pageant too. Would you like me to? Yes. You could teach the other kids the songs you taught me. I looked at David and Heather, checking for objections that might need to be navigated. Heather shrugged, not enthusiastically, but not negatively either. David simply nodded. I'd be honored, I told Emily. Driving home that night, I realized something had fundamentally changed in our family dynamic. Not resolution. We were still working through the complexities of loving people with very different worldviews, but acceptance. The recognition that we could maintain our individual relationships with the sacred without requiring everyone else to share our perspectives. Emily was wonderful tonight, I said into the car's comfortable silence. She was, David agreed. I was proud of her. Even in a religious context? Mom, I may not believe what you believe, but I can see that your faith has made you a better person. And if Emily absorbs some of that goodness along with the theology, I can live with the theology. It wasn't a conversion, but it was something more valuable. Respect. The recognition that my relationship with God had produced fruit worth preserving, even if he couldn't share the tree. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed with a fullness I hadn't felt since George died. Not just gratitude for survival, but joy in purpose. Not just acceptance of my circumstances, but excitement about possibilities. Thank you, I whispered, for showing me that faith shared is faith multiplied, for giving me a community of women who understand that loving you doesn't make us burdens, it makes us bridges, for letting me see Emily shine in your house tonight. I climbed into bed, in my room, in my house where faith was no longer hidden, and fell asleep planning next week's prayer meeting, next month's Bible study lesson, next season's opportunities to serve God by serving his people who'd forgotten they deserved to be loved exactly as they were. For the first time in years, I was excited about tomorrow. 6 months later, as spring painted my garden with the same colors George and I had planned 40 years ago, I stood at my kitchen window watching Emily teach the neighbor children how to plant marigolds. Her gentle patience with the younger ones, her natural instinct to nurture and guide, reminded me so much of the boy David used to be that my heart ached with both grief and gratitude. The house around me hummed with a different energy now. Not the tense silence of people walking on eggshells, but the comfortable quiet of a family that had learned to coexist with honesty rather than resentment. David and Heather had found their own apartment across town 3 months ago, but they visited regularly. Real visits, not obligation calls. Emily spent every Saturday with me, and sometimes she brought friends who were curious about the woman who sang hymns while gardening, and always had fresh cookies cooling on the counter. Mrs. Whitaker, 8-year-old Tommy from next door had asked last week, why do you talk to yourself when you're cooking? I'm not talking to myself, sweetheart. I'm talking to God. Does he talk back? Not with words, but he shows me things, like how much love fits in a batch of chocolate chip cookies, or how prayer can turn ordinary flour into something that makes people smile. Tommy had considered this with the seriousness that children bring to profound questions. Could you teach me how to do that? And so my kitchen had become an informal classroom where neighborhood children learned to bake and pray simultaneously, where the sacred and the everyday blended as naturally as butter and sugar. Their parents, initially hesitant about their children spending time with the religious lady, gradually relaxed as they saw their kids returning home happier, more patient with siblings, more grateful for small kindnesses. This morning's mail had brought a letter that made me sit down at the kitchen table and weep, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming evidence of God's faithfulness. It was from Linda, one of the women from our prayer group, written from her daughter's house in Colorado, where she was visiting her grandchildren for the first time in 3 years. Deborah, she wrote in her careful script, I have to tell you what happened. Sarah called me last month, completely out of the blue, and said she'd been thinking about our last conversation before she moved away. She said she realized she'd been punishing me for having something she'd lost, and she wanted to understand how I'd kept my faith through Dad's cancer and the financial struggles and all the rest. We talked for 3 hours, Deborah. 3 hours? And at the end, she invited me to come meet my grandson. She's not ready to discuss God yet, but she's ready to let me love her without hiding who I am. The prayer group gave me the strength to be myself instead of apologizing for my existence. Thank you for creating that space for us. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where I kept my most treasured correspondence. Letters from George during his business trips, birthday cards from Emily, and now this evidence that our little circle of marginalized believers was producing fruit beyond our basement meetings. The prayer group had grown to 15 women and had spawned 2 additional support groups, one for men whose families struggled with their faith, and another for adult children trying to bridge the gap between their parents' beliefs and their own evolving spirituality. Father Martinez had asked me to consider formal training as a lay minister, a possibility that both thrilled and terrified me. I never went to seminary, I'd protested when he first suggested it. Deborah, you've been living seminary for 68 years. You've learned what can't be taught in classrooms, how to maintain faith under fire, how to love people who don't love you back properly, how to find God in the darkest places. This afternoon was special, Emily's confirmation ceremony. At 13, she had chosen to publicly declare her faith, despite her parents' continued ambivalence about organized religion. David and Heather had agreed to support her decision, understanding finally that their daughter's spiritual journey didn't have to mirror their own disillusionment. I sat in the same third-row pew where I'd watched her Christmas pageant, wearing my best dress and holding a small gift, a delicate gold cross that had belonged to my mother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had found strength in surrendering to something larger than themselves. When Emily walked down the aisle with her confirmation class, her face glowing with the particular radiance of someone making a conscious choice to believe, I felt George's presence beside me as clearly as if he'd taken my hand. He was there in the hymns we'd sung together for decades, in the prayers we'd shared at this altar, in the faith we'd passed to our son and watched him pass to his daughter, despite his own spiritual detours. Bishop Thompson placed his hands on Emily's head as she knelt at the altar rail. Emily Grace Morrison, be sealed with the gift of the Holy Spirit. Amen, she responded, her young voice clear and certain. I wiped tears from my eyes and saw David doing the same 2 seats away. Whatever his struggles with institutional religion, he couldn't deny the beauty of watching his daughter claim her own relationship with the divine. Heather sat stiffly, but she was there, present for this moment that mattered to Emily, respecting something she didn't share. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the parish hall for celebration, Emily ran to me with her confirmation certificate clutched in her hands. Grandma, did you see? I did it. I'm officially confirmed. I saw, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. And look what Bishop Thompson gave me. She held up a small wooden cross, simple but beautifully carved. He said it belonged to his grandmother, and he wanted me to have it because I reminded him of her. How wonderful. What did you tell him about me? I told him that you taught me that faith isn't something you do on Sundays. It's something you live every day. And that you showed me how to pray for people even when they're not very nice to you. David appeared beside us, his expression unreadable. Emily, could I talk to your grandmother for a minute? Emily skipped away to show her certificate to Father Martinez, leaving David and me alone by the refreshment table. Mom, I need to tell you something. I braced myself, old habits of expecting criticism dying hard. Watching Emily up there today, I remembered something I'd forgotten. When I was confirmed, you wrote me a letter. Do you remember? I shook my head. It was so long ago. You told me that confirmation wasn't about promising to be perfect. You said it was about promising to keep seeking God even when life made that hard. You said that faith wasn't a destination. It was a conversation that lasted your whole life. That sounds like something I might have said. I found the letter last week when I was packing some old things. I'd kept it all these years without really knowing why, but reading it again, I realized I never stopped having that conversation with God. I just got angry at him and stopped listening for answers. I looked at my son, this complicated man who had hurt me so deeply and loved me so imperfectly, and saw something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability, spiritual hunger, the willingness to admit that his defenses against faith had also been defenses against wonder. "Are you listening now?" I asked gently. "I'm trying to." Emily's made me realize that maybe the problem wasn't God's silence. Maybe the problem was my assumption that silence meant absence. "And what do you think now?" "I think maybe God was waiting for me to get quiet enough to hear something other than my own arguments." We stood together in the parish hall where Emily was laughing with her confirmation classmates, where families were celebrating their children's spiritual milestones, where the kind of community I'd missed for so many months surrounded us with its imperfect, generous love. "Mom, I want to apologize. Not just for the house thing, or the basement, or the way we treated your faith. I want to apologize for trying to make you smaller so I could feel bigger, for punishing you for having something I thought I'd lost." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because Emily's going to need examples of how to admit when you're wrong, how to ask forgiveness, how to love people even when their truth makes you uncomfortable. And if I can't model that for her, then I haven't learned anything from watching you love me through all my worst behavior." I reached for his hand, finding it warm and real and willing to be held. "I forgive you, David. I forgave you months ago. But more than that, I'm proud of you for recognizing that Emily needs space to grow into her own relationship with God, even if that makes me uncomfortable. Especially then, love isn't comfortable. It's generous." That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the oak tree George and I had planted on our 10th anniversary. Emily was beside me, still wearing her confirmation dress, reading aloud from the Psalms while I deadheaded the roses and listened to the particular music of Scripture spoken by someone who believed every word. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul," Emily read, her 13-year-old voice giving ancient words new life. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you ever angry at God? Like, really angry?" I set down my gardening shears and looked at this child who was growing into a young woman of faith, wisdom, and devastating honesty. "Yes. When Grandpa George died, I was furious. When your parents made me feel ashamed of my prayers, I was confused and hurt. When I felt invisible in my own home, I wondered if God had forgotten about me. What changed? I realized that being angry at God wasn't the same as not believing in God. I could be mad at him and still trust him. I could question him and still love him. I could feel abandoned and still know, deep down, that I wasn't really alone." Emily nodded solemnly. "That's what I told Sarah when she said her parents got divorced because God didn't answer their prayers to stay together." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that maybe God did answer, just not the way they wanted. Maybe he said, 'I love you too much to keep you in something that's making you both miserable.' Maybe the answer was divorce, even though nobody wanted that answer." I stared at my granddaughter, overwhelmed by the spiritual maturity that could reframe rejection as redirection, that could find God's love even in his apparent denials. "That's very wise, Emily. You taught me that. You taught me that God's love isn't about giving us what we want. It's about giving us what we need to become who we're supposed to be." As darkness settled over the garden and the first stars appeared in the clear spring sky, I felt a peace so complete, it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. My family wasn't perfect. David still struggled with faith, Heather still found my prayers excessive, and there were days when the house felt too quiet without George's laughter filling the empty spaces. But I was no longer invisible. My faith was no longer a burden to be hidden or a weakness to be managed. I had found my voice, my purpose, my community of believers who understood that loving God didn't make you strange. It made you strong enough to love people who couldn't love you back properly. Most importantly, I had helped raise a granddaughter who saw beauty in prayer, who found comfort in Scripture, who understood that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being brave enough to keep asking the questions. "Grandma," Emily said as we gathered our things to go inside, "thank you for not giving up on God even when it was hard. Thank you for reminding me that faith is worth defending." That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed with the fullness of someone who had been through the valley of the shadow and emerged with deeper appreciation for the light. I prayed for David's continued spiritual healing, for Heather's eventual peace with mystery, for Emily's growing faith, for the women in our prayer group who were learning to love themselves as God loved them. But mostly, I prayed in gratitude, for second chances, for renewed purpose, for the reminder that God's plans for us are always larger than our plans for ourselves. Thank you, I whispered into the darkness that no longer felt empty, for showing me that when people call our faith a burden, it's because they've forgotten how light their own souls could be if they just remembered how to surrender. I climbed into bed knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to love, to serve, to demonstrate that faith wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be shared with a world that desperately needed reminders of hope. And in the morning, I would wake up excited to see what God had planned next. Have you ever lived through something like this? Or known someone whose faith helped them find their strength when family treated their beliefs as a burden? How did prayer and trust in God's love help them through? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this message touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so these stories can reach someone who needs to hear that their faith is not a burden. It's a bridge to the love that never fails. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this. In Jesus' name, amen.